In this video, we are continuing our discussion of Chapter 1 and sustainability. In the previous video, I talked about 3 principles of sustainability, which were biodiversity, reliance on solar energy, and also the importance of nutrient cycling. Here, we're looking at 3 additional principles of sustainability. And these can be used to think about how can we create a more sustainable future. Our first principle here listed is full cost pricing, and this would come from our discussion of economics and how economics can be applied to ideas of sustainability in the environment. So what full cost pricing is, as listed here, it says it includes harmful environmental and health costs of producing and using goods and services in their market prices. In other words, including the external cost of using resources to produce things that we as humans want and need. We talked about external costs when we were talking about the Lorax. We were talking about, did the Onceler include external costs or think about external costs? So when you produce something, a product, you're thinking about cost of labor and raw materials, but usually you are not thinking about the cost of, say, the pollution that your factory is generating. So the Onceler was creating a lot of air pollution. Probably the prices that he was charging were not reflecting the total cost of that air pollution. This could be really hard to assess, and it would be things like the cost of healthcare for people getting sick, or the cost of asthma medications, maybe. So this could be really difficult, but it's possible. And if we include these external costs, then you're already wrapping up in that the ability to pay for, to make amends for, in a way, the harmful environmental problems that you may be creating. The next principle of sustainability, so this would be number 5 out of the 6 major principles of sustainability, would be looking for win-win solutions to environmental problems. So these would be based on compromise and cooperation to benefit the largest number of people possible and the environment. Another way to word this would be to say to look for equitable solutions. So environmental problems can be complex. They can harm various stakeholder groups. There's people who maybe are relying on some type of operation for their economic gain, and then people, just living their lives who are suffering one way or another because of these operations. So we want to find the best way to make sure that everyone benefits. And again, like dealing with full cost pricing, this could be a fairly complicated solution. It's not always cut and dry to sit down and say, well, this is the best for everyone. If it were easy, then it would just happen all the time, and it doesn't. So this is something that we strive for and something that we need to work for if we're thinking about creating a better future. So the other thing that I should mention about win-win solutions is this would involve politics most often. So actually sitting down and drafting laws and treaties to deal with different environmental issues, and that can be readily applicable to different situations. Finally, our last principle of sustainability, our 6th principle, is responsibility to future generations. So this would fall within the realm of ethics and ethical decisions. And really this is thinking about leaving the planet in the same or better condition than we received it. So this is pretty much the whole idea about sustainability, right? Making sure that resources that we rely on today are available to future generations, not just available, but are still in good shape when they get one. So if you ever need to refer to these principles of sustainability, they're actually inside the back cover of your textbook. And from time to time, it might be good for you to just remind yourselves, or if we're having a discussion or you're writing something, that you go and remind yourselves what are the basic principles of sustainability, and think about applying those in your thoughts, in your comments, and in our discussions. So the next slide in your PowerPoint is just a graphic showing you these different realms that these principles fall in. So the last three that we talked about. Up top, we can see economics and the idea of full cost pricing, so involving external costs when we actually price market goods. The next one we talked about here was politics, so win-win results, or finding equitable solutions that are fair to all groups, to environmental problems. And then lastly, here we talked about ethics, so thinking about our responsibility to future generations and leaving the planet how either we found it, or preferably in better shape than we found it. So we've talked a little bit in class about how countries might differ in their resource use. We've been talking about ecological footprints and how those are different in different places in the world. Oops, let's just go back a slide here. So again, we are wondering, is there a shared responsibility around the world? Of course, there's shared responsibility, but is the impact that we're having on natural resources the same worldwide? And the short answer is no, it is not the same. When we're thinking about different types of resource utilization, or the amount of resources that are used globally, it kind of makes it easy to break countries down into their classification. So are they more developed? Are they less developed? Maybe they're moderately developed countries. This can have an effect on how resources are used in that respective country. So the UN classifies countries as either economically more developed or less developed. This is primarily based on the average income per person. And so more developed countries would be countries that are industrialized and have a high average income per person, or you could say high per capita income. These would be countries like the US, Japan, Canada, Australia, Germany, and most other European countries. In terms of world population, these make up about 17% of the world's population. So the people living in these countries account for about 17% of the world's population, but they are consuming, or we are part of this, we are consuming about 70% of the world's natural resources. The United States specifically makes up only about 4.3% of the world's population. Our population is currently at about 330 million people. And as a country, we are currently using about 30% of the world's resources. The next category would be less developed countries, and this actually would include countries that are more moderately developed and then countries that are the least developed countries in the world. So less developed, moderately developed countries would be sort of like middle income average per person, and this would be places like China, India, Brazil. Thailand is moderately developed, and Mexico. The least developed and lowest income per capita countries would include places like Nigeria, Bangladesh, Congo, and Haiti. Of course, there are others that I'm not listing here. Less developed countries make up about 83% of the world's population. And despite accounting for most of the people in the world, use only about 30% of the world's resources. So when we're thinking about our ecological footprints and the differences around the world, as your book states, there's both good news and bad news. The good news is that a lot of people have a better quality of life now than they did before. But the bad news is that we're living unsustainably. So this idea of having a better quality of life, where, as it says here, we've developed useful materials and products, right? So we've increased, we've had all these advances in technology. More people have access to cars and cell phones or even just electricity. Lifespans are increasing due to better health care and more availability in different places. Our food supply is more abundant and safer. So again, with increases in technology, we've been able to increase food supplies, or, with more scientific research into different safe fertilizers or just farming methods, and being able to ship things or transport things faster. Food products might be safer. And then we have more avoidable exposure, or we are not as exposed to toxic chemicals as we might have been in the past. So here at the bottom, it says humans have protected some endangered species and ecosystems. This is just saying, we're not doing everything wrong. So overall, we are living unsustainably and need to take more measures to deal with that. But a lot of people are working to correct environmental problems that humans have caused, like habitat loss and its impact on species. Okay, so again, this is the bad news. We're living unsustainably. Through our different activities as humans, we're directly affecting 83% of the Earth's land surface. Here it says through things like urban development, crop and energy production, mining, timber cutting, and more. So more could be things like even just our recreational activities. It could be things like waste burial. There's a whole range of things that we do as humans that impact the earth and are creating environmental degradation. A lot of these were talked about in the crash course video that you watched. So those 5 impacts, which were deforestation, desertification, invasive species, global warming or climate change, and overharvesting. And of course, the guy mentioned this, but he didn't go into any detail about pollution, because pollution is just worth a whole video unto itself. So if you look at this picture here, it's just illustrating some of the ways that we are living unsustainably, and your book gives a whole list of things that we are doing to degrade natural capital. So deforestation, our forests are shrinking. Desertification, our deserts are growing, which leaves less fertile soil or no soil. Soil that may be fertile is eroding. Our lower atmosphere temperatures are warming. Ice and glaciers are melting. Sea levels are rising. Ocean acidity is increasing. We are having more intense floods and other storm systems. We are experiencing droughts. So I said storm systems, so just more severe weather, more forest fires. We also have rivers drying up, even though in some places it's flooding and having more extreme rain. Fisheries are decreasing, right? So there's a lot that we're doing. 20% of coral reefs are gone, and a lot of others are threatened. And as you see in this previous slide, species are going extinct 100 times faster than in pre-human times. So extinction rates are projected to increase another 100-fold in this century alone. And this is driving what most people are calling the sixth mass extinction, right? So in my previous video, I mentioned that there have been 5 mass extinctions, wiping out anywhere from 60 to 90% of the planet's species, and we are on the verge of a 6th mass extinction. So of this 83% of Earth's land that humans are using for different purposes, here you can see things such as, how we're impacting that 83% of land through forest loss, overgrazing, erosion, oil spills, fertilizer runoff. How are we using that land? So we can think about land as either privately owned or publicly owned. So private lands would be lands owned by individuals or businesses. These would be things used for purposes such as growing crops, grazing livestock, harvesting timber, mining operations, housing, and building other things, buildings. And then we have public lands. So these are typically owned jointly by citizens of a country, but are managed by the government. In the United States, the federal government owns and manages about 28% of our land. 47% of this land is in the western United States and 61% in Alaska. Or sorry, I should restate that as 47% of the land in the western United States is public land, and 61% of the land in Alaska is considered public land. Right, so this next slide is just giving you examples of the different types of public lands. So we have our national park system, which we'll talk about more, which is managed by the National Park System. We have the National Forest System, which is managed by the U.S. Forest Service. The land, which is managed by the Bureau of Land Management. We have National Wildlife Refuges, which are managed by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. And we have this National Wilderness Preservation System, which consists of areas in all these other systems that I've mentioned and that are listed here, and would be managed by the corresponding agencies. So for instance, this could be land within a national park system that is open only for a recreational activity like hiking or fishing or camping. This graphic here is showing you of this 83% of land that humans are utilizing for some reason, what the actual footprint is in the different areas. So here at the bottom, you see human footprint index. So the green would be places where people are not having much impact on resources. And then going to black, which would be very heavy. But if you look at the map, really you only see areas that have like dark red coloring, which would mean we're having a pretty big impact. So if you go up here to the United States, right, you can see that areas in the eastern half of the United States, which would be the areas that really are industrialized areas, we have a very large ecological footprint. So I'm not going to talk again about what an ecological footprint is. I think we all know that, but I do want you to notice here that it says an ecological footprint is a sustainability measure that relates to the Earth's biocapacity, and I just want you to understand what biocapacity is. So biocapacity is basically a measurement of the Earth's productive ecosystems that would be needed or necessary to regenerate the renewable resources that we rely on. So it could be the resources of a city or a whole country or the entire world in a given year, right? So how, what proportion of ecosystems are needed to produce those natural resources that we rely on. Okay, and then I just want to give a statistic to you. In 2012, the world's footprint was 50% higher than the Earth's estimated long-term biocapacity. Okay, so in other words, we would need 1.5 Earths to sustain the renewable resource use that the world had in 2012. If you think about the ecological footprints that we've discussed in class, with a lot of our ecological footprints going as high as 4.5 Earths, 1.5 really isn't that bad, really, if you think about it. And so what that's saying is, even though here in the United States we're really big consumers, we use a lot of resources, it's averaged out across the world of what we use here versus what people in a less developed country might be using. All right, I know the video is getting long, so I just want to wrap up with these next two slides. And actually, this equation is called the IPAT equation, and we'll talk about this in class and look at some examples. Basically, it is just another way of thinking about ecological footprint, but with more solid numbers as a mathematical equation or a model. So we'll talk about that in class. Right, so this is the last slide I'm going to cover in this lecture. And it's just talking about how cultural changes in society can either increase or decrease our ecological footprints. So we've had 3 major cultural events that have lended to really increasing ecological footprints. So the first would be the agricultural revolution, which began about 10,000 years ago. So this would be when we were shifting from being hunter-gatherers to growing and breeding plants and animals and living in villages. Of course, this resulted in more reliable sources of food, which led to longer lifespans and more children surviving to adulthood. So this would have, down the road, lended to larger civilizations, to bigger population sizes, which can heavily influence ecological footprint. This next one is the industrial medical revolution. So this began about 300 years ago. And this would be, large scale production of food, people moving from rural areas to more urban areas, learning how to get energy from fossil fuels and using those in different capacities. And with the medical part of this revolution, even longer lifespans and access to medical advances and technology to live healthier lives. Okay, and then lastly, here you see this information globalization revolution. So this would be just starting about 50 years ago, and with the development of new technology, which allows us for very quick access to information and resources on a global scale. So all of these 3 cultural changes have given us access to more types of energy, like fossil fuels, and now have more access to new technologies, and technologies are developing all the time. And so what this has really allowed us to do is alter and control more of our planet's resources, right, to meet our needs and our wants. and really, as I mentioned before, has lended to increased ecological footprints. It is important, though, to note that advances in technology are also allowing us to shrink our ecological footprints. And of course, today there's a big push for technology that is shrinking these. And so some people actually see this as evidence of a fourth cultural shift, which would be the sustainability revolution. So, a lot of what we talk about in this class can seem like these gloom and doom scenarios, but it's always important to think about the positive things that we're doing as a society and the ways that we are trying to help our environment.